I want to start at the beginning. What was the first campaign that you launched on Kickstarter?
Well, it was for a new book in my Dan Chamble Zombie PI series. And
Which is hilarious, by the way, if you haven't read any of them.
Series. It's like the Addams Family meets the Naked Gun. And it is, I have so much fun writing it. I laugh out loud. It's a bunch of dad jokes and it's silly, but they're just hugely entertaining. Everybody who reads them just loves it. They snicker through it. And Kevin J. Anderson, was basically known as writing these big doorstop science fiction, space operas, and Dune novels, and pretty serious stuff. I got inspired to write the first Dan Chamble book. So my wife and I would always watch The Walking Dead, and I watched World War Z and 28 Days Later. And I enjoy those, but I kind of got, this is so dreary. Isn't it time for Spaceballs in this genre? And it kind of captured my imagination about this world where it's mummies and ghosts and werewolves and zombies, and this guy's a PI, and he's just solving, because werewolves get divorced too, and vampires have property disputes. And it just was this funny thing. And it just kind of grabbed hold of me. And I'm a very prolific writer, so I had turned in this big, I don't remember if it was a Dune book or a Seven Sons book or something. And I just kind of took a break and I wrote the first Dan Chamble book. And I just loved it to pieces. And I wrote it on spec, did the complete book, and I sent it to my agent, and he said, wow, this is hilarious, but Kevin Anderson can't write funny stuff. And I went, well, you just said it was hilarious. He said, yeah, but you're not allowed to write this stuff. You write big science fiction. And he said, well, but I did, and I liked writing it. And so he sent it around to all my publishers, and they said, this is hilarious, but Kevin Anderson can't write funny stuff. And I said, well, I'll do it under a pseudonym. And they went, well, no, because then we'd lose all your name recognition. And I went, well, okay, but then what? And so we did get it published with a traditional publisher, and they published the first 3. But again, this is kind of where the indie author Kevin and the trad publishing house didn't quite see eye to eye, because these are fast and fun and hilarious, and they're popcorn books. You finish reading them in a couple of days and you want the next one. And I'm a pretty fast writer, and I sold the first 3 books in the series, and I said, all right, what we need to do is we need to do the wham bam, let's get them all out, let's publish them every 6 months, I'll keep writing them because people are going to want the next one. And they went, well, that's not the way we do things, we're going to publish them a year and a half apart. And I went, well, but how does that build the audience? But, they're the trad publisher. So, okay, they went. And then it comes out, and they published the trade paperback version that cost $15. And they published the ebook version, which, guess how much the ebook version cost?
$15.
$15. And I went, well, but that doesn't make any sense. It's an email. You don't pay anything for it. And they said, well, we don't want to cut into our sales for print books. I went, but that's too much money. And then they came back and said, well, your ebook sales are disappointing.
Ebook sales are dismal.
Yeah. So they published the first 3, and they didn't really want to do any more. But I loved this series. I said, please, let's do another one. So I talked to Jim Butcher and Sherilyn Kenyon and L.A. Banks and Kelly Armstrong, all these other friends that did these kind of fun urban fantasy detective kind of things. Every single one of them said that their series didn't take off until like book 5 or 6. And I, going back to my publisher, saying, you can't give up after book 3. So I twisted their arm, and they bought book number 4 and kind of brought it out without a lot of fanfare and said, see, it's not taking off. But I love this. I kept writing short stories, and I published a short story collection. And I eventually just wrote my own next Dan Chamble book that I just published through Wordfire. But it just came out. I didn't do a huge amount with it. And it did fine for us. But remember, I'm writing big Dune books and everything. So it wasn't not enough incentive for me to give up all my other stuff to keep writing Dan Chamble books. And then so I kind of stopped writing them. And fans kept asking me, when's the next one? I went, well, they're doing okay. Oh, and I had gotten all the rights back, so I had reissued them all at Wordfire Press. And finally, a friend of yours too, Damon, Dean Wesley Smith, who had run a bunch of Kickstarters, said, well, Kevin, why don't you run a Kickstarter? And I said, well, but Kickstarters, aren't those for like authors saying, I can't afford to eat ramen noodle soup, give me some money? And he said, oh, no, that's not what Kickstarters are about. And he took me to the woodshed and gave me some schooling. And it really changed my mind. It was like, so Kickstarters are more like the Backstage Club. This is like for people to pre-order your book and to get the early copies and to get special editions and to get fun extra stuff. I had never done one before, and I went, well, but I wanted to write another Dan Chamble book, and people kept asking for it. So I thought, all right, I'll run a Kickstarter. Let's let them put their money where their mouth is. And if they want it, then they'll pay me enough to make it worthwhile. And so I launched my first Kickstarter for the next Dan Chamble book. And holy cow, I made 3 times as much money as the trad publisher is paying me. And I did okay, so what was it, Sally Fields? You like me, you really like me. And so I could tell by direct evidence that there really was an audience there that wanted this series. And I went, well, maybe there's hope for some of my other series that I had given up on because the other publishers...
The publisher said they didn't want any more. Readers don't want to read that anymore.
Right.
And here you are, and you're like, no, there are readers out there that were waiting for the next Dan Chamble's novel. They were asking you. Sometimes you get those emails, and you're like, well, they're asking. So, like, what does that mean? Like 5 people are going to buy it?
Right. So if I make $300 on it, it's not really worth me writing a whole novel for it, right?
Right.
And so this really kind of blew my mind. And I had another series, and this is humorous stuff. Remember, I like doing this. My wife says, Kevin, you must be writing a new Dan Chamble book. I can tell because you're always in a good mood.
That's funny.
I like that. I like enjoying it. And I had written another comedy thing, and I have a good sense of humor. I like being funny. And there isn't a lot of comic relief in the Dune books. Let's just put that out there, okay?
Right.
I like being funny and laughing. And I had another series. It was a fantasy comedy called The Dragon Business, sort of like Dirty Rotten Scoundrels meet The Princess Bride. It was these con men that sell their services as dragon slayers. And I had published the first book. Amazon has their print imprint called 47 North. And they did the print book, and they commissioned this one. And surprise, surprise, brick and mortar bookstores don't like to carry books published by Amazon.
Right.
Again, so the print books did okay with that one, but not enough to make me go, wow, I'm going to write a bunch more of these. But I love this series, and I wanted to do a sequel to it. So I had gotten the rights back to The Dragon Business, and I thought, after the Dan Chamble Kickstarter, well, hey, let's offer a reprint of The Dragon Business with a new cover, and let's write a sequel to it, and let's see if the Kickstarter people want to do it. And so I got a brand new cover done, which I have a Ukrainian artist team, and it just so happened that they were doing these paintings right when the war in Ukraine started, so everybody was sympathizing with the Ukrainians, and these artists were truly writing me letters saying, can we have one extra day on our deadline because we're being bombed right now and the power just went out. I went, yeah, okay, you can have one extra day. But I put that out there in the Kickstarter. So I've got these Ukrainian artists, and I've got this funny fantasy series, and I want to do a sequel to it. And, who wants to back the Kickstarter? And that one did even better than the Dan Chamble one did.
Which is interesting because there was no built-in audience, as opposed to there were Dan Chamble's fans out there that when they wanted to, there's a new Dan Chamble's, great. This was a book that probably, Amazon sold it, but probably didn't move a lot of copies. So technically a sequel and a reissue of the first book. But yeah, no built-in audience coming to this campaign.
Right. But it was also new stuff, and the built-in audience were Kevin Anderson fans that I had put together. And that worked just wonderfully well. And suddenly I'm realizing this is a truly viable way for an author to do the books that this is my passion project. I wanted to write another Dragon Business book, but no publisher wanted it. I could have given it to my agent, and he would have taken it around to all the trad publishers, and they would have all turned it down because it would be the second book of the first book that Amazon published that didn't do great.
Yeah. And not a great pitch. Maybe don't put that on the query letter.
And what publisher would want to pick up book 7 or 8 in the Dan Chamble series why? Nobody would do that. So in the old traditional world, that series would have been dead on arrival, even though he is a zombie and he's, that's a good selling point.
He is dead. He's undead on arrival.
But it gave me a chance to I can do this. And once the Dan Chamble one took off and then the Dragon Business one took off, my head exploded. It's like, I can now do these things that I thought were just stuck in the dusty crypt. And what other books do I want to do that I've really wanted to do? And, it was terrific.
Speaking of which, your most successful campaign was actually talking about Kevin J. Anderson fans, right? So people that are fans of your work. Your biggest campaign so far, which did almost
80,000. But I really have high hopes for this one. We'll talk about this one, but
so this one did almost $80,000, and this was a collection of short fiction, right? Which I would be willing to guess that most authors listening probably think there's no money in short fiction whatsoever. Like nobody, not that nobody writes it, but nobody's going to buy it, right? You can't sell it on Amazon. You can't do anything with it. So what good is it? But this was actually your biggest campaign so far, was Kevin J. Anderson short fiction. Did you expect that kind of response, or was this a big shock to you?
I did, but nobody else did.
Okay, there you go.
But there's actually more to the pitch than that. I've been writing short stories for a long time. And in fact, last month, January 2025, marked my 40th anniversary as a professionally published author. My first prose story was in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in January 1985.
Wow.
And I have written a lot of short stories for Asimov's and Analog and Fantasy and Science Fiction, and I even had a piece published in Playboy back when Playboy was published. And I had small press magazines and tons of anthologies. And when I broke into the business, the career path was you wrote a bunch of short stories and got them published and earned your chops, and then you started to work on a novel. Well, people publish short stories now, but it's not like the main career path anymore to write short stories to break in. But I had a whole bunch of short stories, and I kind of wanted, in fact, a few years ago, I had done a couple of volumes of here's my best science fiction stories, and here's my best fantasy stories. And Wordfire published them, and they were for my collectors and stuff. But I got this idea in my head that if I went back and I started going through all of my old computer files and everything, I had something like 150 short stories that were out there. And they were in science fiction stories and fantasy stories and horror stories, and they were just all there. And once I realized how many I had, then I started digging, and I found published stories that I didn't even remember I had written until I opened up the magazine and went, oh, that was a good one. I completely forgot about that. And so I started gathering, and a lot of these are there's no digital copies at all. These were printed in old fanzines and things like that. And so as you can start guessing, this is a huge project to just collate all this stuff, and then you got to scan them or retype them and everything, and then clean them up and proof them, and so it started getting to be bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I wanted to do not just a couple of collections of here's my best science fiction stories. I thought, well, what if we do all of them, or at least all of? They're still called selected stories because some of them are really old and clunky, and I didn't want to reprint them. But there was also, I did some X-Files short stories and Predator short stories and Star Wars short stories, and those are owned by the studios, and I tried to get the rights back, but they just wouldn't let me reprint them. So I can't say it's the complete works. And then when I'm digging through these boxes, what I found was, when I was, I think, 16 years old or something, was my very first short story that I sold to a small press magazine for $12.50.
Wow.
I found the little magazine for that. And then I found that my mom had kept these in the Keepsakes of Kevin box. And I found this little magazine where I had published a short story when I was a junior in high school about these Wisconsin high school writings magazine that probably had 100 copies printed or something. Well, I had an old yellowed copy of that. And then I found at the bottom of the box these 3 pieces of pink paper where I found the first novel that I wrote on my dad's typewriter when I was 8 years old, about this mad scientist bringing dinosaur bones to life. And so there, with this 8-year-old, when I was 8 years old writing it, and then my first high school publication, and the very first story that I got paid in a magazine for, it all kind of came together that this was if you did the numbers, it was literally 50 years of my career from that first 8-year-old thing. And if I put all these things together, I took all of them, and for each story, I wrote this little introduction of, here's how I wrote the story, or here's what was going on in my life when I wrote this one, or here's what inspired this one. So each story has this little, I'm Kevin Anderson being Rod Serling narrating the little story. And in my mind, it went from being just a collection of stories to being a big frickin' deal. And I thought, this is the kind of thing that I can pitch to my fans.
Like a memoir of your writing.
Well, so again, this is a huge amount of effort just to compile all this stuff. I remember it took me several, and I mean full-time days, just to type up the previously published and copyright information for all of these things. And I thought, I want this to be my next big Kickstarter, because I had done really well on the other ones. And my wife, Rebecca, was like, I don't see it. It's short stories. Let's not get our hopes up too much. And Marie Whitaker, who's our associate publisher, and Damon, you know her, Marie was like, you really want that to be your next Kickstarter? Why don't we come up with something big? And I went, no, I feel it in my bones. This will be big. And boy, they were like, well, let's kind of set our sights low. Maybe this one won't be that big. But, and again, I said Dean Wesley Smith had pushed me to do Kickstarters. They do tons of them, and they're okay with less successful ones, and they're okay for bigger ones. But so I was being told, maybe this one will get $10,000 or something like that, which compared to the other ones, it's much lower. But I just felt like this would be something my fans would rally around. And we launched it, and yep, it blew the roof off, and it was better. When you add, there were like late pledges and stuff, we did go over $80,000 on it. Yeah. But as I was putting this together, I knew the answer, but I contacted my New York literary agent. And I said, so John, I'm doing this big project, and I want to do a 7-volume collection of all my short fiction reprints, and I want them all in hardcover. So who would you be able to sell this to in New York? And he was like silent for a second. Then he kind of laughed, and he went, well, nobody would want that.
No, I was like, no one.
Nobody would want that. And, because he's my agent, so I kind of technically said, here's this big project. Do you want to try to sell it or not? And I knew he wasn't. But that's a perfect example of the Kickstarter thing, that I knew what my fans wanted, and they ponied up with their money, and they bought the 7-volume hardcover sets and the ebooks, and it just, it even blew me away, but I understood it. Now, the other side of that, though, is these books aren't selling like crazy on Amazon. They're out there. They're still like short story collections, and people buy them, and I sold some at the book signing last night. But that huge Kickstarter response was not an indicator that they were going to keep selling thousands of copies a year. I tapped into the core audience that wanted them, and they kind of all bought it in the Kickstarter.
And yet,
I'm happy with the $80,000.
I was going to say, if you'd sold that into tradition, if your agent had said, absolutely, I can go, and somebody's offered you an advance of $80,000, and then you were never going to earn out on that book, the $80,000 was all you were going to see, you'd still walk away with that check and be like, that's good. I feel pretty good about that.
You would all been happy about it. That showed me the power of, if you can do a big project for a core audience, it can be as rewarding, or if not more, than a more diffuse project that has to go out to millions of readers, and you hope that 80,000 of them buy it.
Right.
Thank you for watching. Check out these other videos from BookFunnel, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.